I'm Tama Matheson, Artistic Director of the 4MBS Brisbane Shakespeare Festival, and as I'm unable to be there in person this year because of the pandemic, I thought I'd talk a little bit on the internet and discuss some aspects of William Shakespeare. And the first aspect I'd like to discuss are his sonnets, which seem to me some of the most interesting productions of his magisterial and incredibly fecund pen. Now, what I'd like to do is suggest a slightly different way of understanding the sonnets, because I think it's impossible to understand Shakespeare's sonnets without understanding something of the history of sonnet writing, and the way in which sonnets were written in those days. In general, these poems are presented as rather somber, serious, and sentimental poems about the idea of love. In fact, I think they have an awful lot of wit, a lot of self-referential, what's now called metatextual wit, and they refer to the idea of sonnet poetry as it existed in those days and mock it and transform it and turn it on its head. And I think they're even more extraordinary when you look at them that way, when they're not just read as serious, earnest pieces of saccharine love poetry, but real investigations of the idea of love and an exploding of the very notion of sonnet writing. Now, sonnets in those days tended to be paeans or encomiums to the beloved, whoever that may be, an object of one's love. And the style of writing was one of extravagant, flamboyant, and costly verbiage, in which you would compare the beloved to all sorts of impossibly beautiful things. Rainstorms and winter skies and golden sunshines over wheat fields, etc. So you would find the most extravagant and expensive ways of expressing one's love. And this was called a euphuistic way of talking, from a novel written by John Lilly called Euphues, in which he developed an incredibly florid and flamboyant style of writing. And this was picked up by poets all over the place, so that sonnets, when they were written as songs of praise to people, were filled with the most effusive and rather overblown language, in order to try and capture those, what Browning called the first fine, careless rapture of love. Incidentally, sonnet is from the Italian sonetto, which means a little sound. And all it means is a small poem, in essence. It tends to be 14 lines, and all of Shakespeare's sonnets are 14 lines, but it could be 12 or 13 or 17 or 18, depending on the poet's fancy, as long as essentially it makes a little black block on the page, like this. And that is essentially a sonnet, a small, compressed, condensed, and concentrated form of literary utterance, usually in praise of something. And there were several sonnet sequences by all sorts of people, which were very extravagant in their praise of the beloved object. And Shakespeare somewhat takes this apart in these poems. Now, it does seem that these sonnets are autobiographical. A story seems to unfold as one moves through the sonnets, which leads one to believe that these are real expressions of the poet's passion. But even at his most earnest, Shakespeare is still able to do all sorts of wordplay. And I want to explain to you exactly how that works by looking at two of the most famous sonnets. And they are, of course, sonnet number 18, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, and sonnet 116, which is Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds, which are often anthologized in books of love poetry, and they're read at weddings and birthdays and what have you. And they're usually seen as rather straightforward expressions of love. Let's just have a little look at Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day. Very simply, he seems to be just making a direct comparison between certain phenomena of nature and his beloved. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date, etc., etc. And we all sort of know this poem because it's just in our collective consciousness. But what one has to understand is that there's mockery over the very idea of sonnet writing in this. So he takes apart the overblown and euphuistic expression of sonnet writing, which was extant at the time. And I'll show you what I mean. Imagine that this young boy, to whom Shakespeare is writing the sonnets, comes up to William Shakespeare and he says, I've just read another sonnet which a poet has written to me, in which he compares me to a summer's day, and he says I'm as lovely as the darling buds of May. And Shakespeare takes this poem and he says, let me have a look at that. Yes, summer's day, that lovely summer's day. You're temperate as that. You remind him of the darling buds of May, and you're as important as summer's lease, and the eye of heaven and its golden complexion. These are all beautiful expressions, yes. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance, or nature's changing course, untrimmed. So what Shakespeare is doing at this point is taking the quotations, the overblown euphuistic quotations of other sonnet writers. You are like a summer's day, you're like the darling buds of May, you're as fair as the complexion of the sun, etc., takes it apart, says this is how easy it is to out-top that kind of writing. You're lovelier than that. I think it's so easy to write those things that they are essentially meaningless. And then on the sestet, because a sonnet is often made of 8 lines and then 6 lines, in which you put a proposition, then a counter proposition. That's called the octet and the sestet. And then he does an extraordinary thing. He says, okay, that's comparing you to a false summer, or at least a real summer, which is a fading, evanescent thing. And then he says, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So Shakespeare then turns poetic convention on his head and makes it incredibly serious. Having mocked the conventional utterances, then he adds an utterance which is so much more powerful, talking about how I can turn you into an eternally youthful love and an unending summer by the power of this writing. So he's able to actually invert and overpower the conventional idea of love poetry and create something that is infinitely more earnest, even while it mocks the form which itself is taking. Now let's look at Sonnet 116, which is so often quoted at weddings, as this sort of pure and idealized form of romantic love. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with a remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken, etc., etc. Now imagine that the young boy to whom Shakespeare is writing these sonnets has come back to him again with some kind of petulance, some kind of amatory petulance, saying, well, I don't know if you really love me. Maybe you're going off with other people. Maybe I'll go off with someone else if you don't satisfy me the way I want. In any case, how do I know this is real love, etc.? And all those sort of accusations and jealousies and envies that creep up on one and poison the well of love, which we've all felt at one stage. And Shakespeare, rather than being soft and gentle and singing out this saccharine love poetry, is angry, and in the moment of anger says, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with a remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours or weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So in his momentary fury, Shakespeare rises to a rhetorical eloquence that is irresistible. And he ends with two extraordinary claims. If everything I've said about love is untrue, then I didn't even write this, even though you've seen me in the act of writing, which is an incredible claim. And then even more incredible, not only that, but if all this is false, then no man has ever loved before. And that's, I think, a way of reading the sonnets that's more powerful than the ordinary sentimental reading, and I wanted to offer that up as a way of approaching these marvelous, marvelous works.